This issue of The Walking Dead audio comic is presented in episodic order. If this is the first episode you're listening to, please go back to episode 1 and listen from there. The following podcast is for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is advised. Previously on The Walking Dead audio comic. Rick meets the group at the camp, which includes his wife Lori, son Carl, and partner Shane. The next day, Dale warns Rick that Shane has had his eye on Lori, which Rick brushes off. He and Shane go hunting while the kids play and the women do laundry. Lori tells the woman the story of how she and Rick met, and on the way back they are attacked by a creature that had been hidden in some brush. Donna is stunned by the attack, and Dale comes for a rescue, killing the creature by lopping its head off with an axe, seconds before it gets her. Meanwhile, Rick and Shane debate over whether to take a deer from a creature when a shot goes off. The two men rush back to the camp where they learn of the attack. As Lori and Rick embrace, Shane looks on, jealous. And now, issue 4 of The Walking Dead audio comic. Night fell on the camp as the group headed off to sleep as best they could from the events of the day. Shane stood watch atop the camper, rifle in hand, while behind him clothes dried on a makeshift clothesline near a roaring campfire. "Psst," a voice whispered in the darkness. Shane turned to glance at the back of the camper, a worried look on his face. "Jesus, man, don't sneak up on me like that," he said as Rick popped his head over the top of the camper. Rick smiled at his partner and replied, "Sorry, I was just trying to get up here without waking anyone up." Shane smiled back at Rick and said, "Well, next time throw a rock at me or something. You scared me half to death, especially after what happened earlier today." Shane laid the shotgun across his lap as Rick knelt down to swing his legs over the roof of the camper to sit down. "Yeah, that's actually what I came to talk to you about." "Oh?" Shane replied, a curious look on his face. Rick got comfortable as best he could on the hard metal roof of the camper and said, "We need to move camp. It's not smart to be this close to a city full of those things. It's just too goddamn dangerous." Shane couldn't believe what Rick had just said to him. He leaned back to look at Rick with an incredulous look on his face. "Are you crazy?" he said loudly. "What happens when the government starts cleaning this mess up? They'll have to start with the cities. They'll find us faster if we stay here." Rick replied, his voice raised now. "When are they coming, Shane? Tomorrow? Next week? It's getting really damn cold out here, and it's only going to get worse. Not to mention what happened yesterday. It's too risky to stay so damn close to them." Shane's face hardened and his brow furrowed under his police cap as he said to Rick, "It's too risky to go somewhere else. The fires are keeping us warm. There's plenty of firewood in this area. We'll be fine here. This is the best place to be for the rescue." Disappointed, Rick replied, "What makes you so sure we're even going to be rescued? Don almost died yesterday. What if it was one of the kids? What if it was Carl?" Rick tried desperately to reason with his partner. "Nobody was prepared for this, Shane. You think those girls know how to fight?" Rick put his hand on Shane's shoulder and calmed his tone down. "If we go someplace safer, maybe we won't need to be rescued so soon. I'd rather be able to get a good night's sleep every once in a while than have to sit up at night hoping the government is still intact and is going to find us. Shane got even angrier as he slapped Rick's hand away from his shoulder. No, damn it. We're staying right here. We're safe here. Yesterday is one of very few isolated incidents. This is the safest place to be. Shane collected himself and continued. Rick, we can protect these people. We'll be rescued here. If we go hide in the country, it could take months for them to find us. We've got to stay here. Rick considered what Shane said and conceded to him. Okay, if you feel that certain that's the best thing for us, fine. We'll stay. But if we're going to try and hold out here, we're going to need more guns. If Donna had been carrying one yesterday, she could have just turned around and shot that thing. Everyone here is going to need to carry a gun at all times. Shane turned to Rick with a concerned look on his face. How are we going to find enough guns for that? Rick just stared off into the distance and replied, I'll figure something out. Down below the two, from out of the shadows, Dale emerged from the camper and bitterly said, Can you keep it down up there? Some of us are trying to sleep. The next morning, Glenn started off to the city for his normal supply run when Rick called out from behind the camper, Hey Glenn, wait up! Glenn turned to look at Rick and replied, What can I do for you, Rick? Rick made his way over towards Glenn and asked, When you go into town, have you ever seen a gun store or anything like that? Glenn replied, No, but I never really go into the city that far. Why do you ask? Well, I'm thinking, if everyone was herded into the cities for protection, there wouldn't have been much looting if everything was being organized by the government, Rick explained. And when everything went to shit, there's no way anyone would have had the time to break into one of the gun stores. Those places are usually barred up, and no one would have been able to get through that without being attacked and eaten. Glenn thought for a minute. That does make a whole lot of sense. And while I don't know exactly where a gun store may be, I think I know someone who might. Together, Rick and Glenn made their way over to Jim, who was enjoying a morning can of pork and beans. As they approached him, Glenn called out, Jim, you gotta help us out, man. Do you remember any gun stores close to the edge of town here in Atlanta? Jim continued spooning out the pork and beans and without looking up replied, Gun store? Corner Pleasant, 38th Street. Thanks, Jim, Glenn said as he turned to Rick. Come on, I've got a map in my car. Glenn opened the door to his car and got in to look for a map in the glove box. As he opened it, a pile of papers and other things spilled out into the car. It's got to be here somewhere. Outside, Rick explained to Lori what the plan was. I know we need guns, but why do you have to go? This is your third day here. I don't want to have to worry about you again, Lori angrily said to Rick, a surprised look on his face. Carl, who stood next to his mother, looked up at his father and said, Daddy, please don't go. Rick took his hat from his head, placed it on Carl, and leaned down to look him in the eyes. You don't have to worry, son. I'll be really careful. This has to be done so we can all be safe. When I get back, I'll teach you how to shoot a gun. You want to know how to shoot a gun, don't you? Carl looked back at his father and replied, I guess. Upon hearing Rick say this to Carl, Lori became irate. No way! He's too young to shoot a gun. Rick looked at his wife and responded, We'll argue about that when I get back. Don't worry. I'll be here before you notice I'm gone. Glenn will keep me safe. How many times has he gone into town and come back fine? Lori looked at her husband as the anger turned to worry. I just don't understand why he can't go alone. Why do you have to go with him? Rick stepped towards his wife and gave her a peck on the cheek. As he did, he said to her, How many guns do you think Glenn can carry? Come on, hon, be reasonable. Behind them, Glenn called out, Got it, as he held up the map. As Rick walked off to catch up with Glenn, Lori called out, Be careful. Without looking back at her, Rick said, Don't worry, hon. I'll be fine. I love you. I love you, too. Glenn studied the map he had located in his car as he and Rick walked through the woods and away from the camp. What's up with Jim? Is he okay? Rick asked Glenn, who continued to stare at the map. Well, remember when I told you we had a guy at camp that actually made it out of Atlanta alive? Glenn replied. Yeah, Rick said, shifting his eyes towards Glenn. Well, Jim's that guy, Glenn replied without averting his eyes from the map. At the time, you had just told me that you thought Lori and Carl were in there, and I was trying to give you hope. The thing is, Jim got out of the city, but he saw his entire family torn apart before he did. Oh, Rick said as he stared at Glenn with a dazed look on his face. He told the story once. It was like they were shielding him from the army of zombies that had surrounded them. His wife, his sister, her husband. Between them, they had like 5 kids. I can't really remember, but I think his mom might have been there too, Glenn said. He only made his way through the crowd because those monsters were busy eating everyone else. He said it happened so fast, he didn't even realize what was going on until he had made his way to safety. As they continued to walk, Glenn finally located what he was looking for on the map, and he didn't like it. "Damn it!" he yelled out and stopped dead in his tracks. Rick stopped as well and looked at him. "What?" Glenn turned his head to look at Rick and said, "Jim's gun store is 5 blocks from where I found you. I never go that far in. There is no way we can do this." A look of steely determination came across Rick's face as a thought popped into his head. "Follow me. I've got an idea." As they started to walk again, Rick turned and headed off in a direction different than the one they had originally been going in. "Come on, this way," he said to Glenn as he moved towards a familiar spot. Glenn watched as he walked away and then called out, "The city is that way. Where are we going?" He held up his hand, the map still in it, and pointed down the path they were originally on. Rick turned his head back to look at Glenn as he continued moving and said, "Trust me, you don't want to know." The two men came into a secluded wooded area that was well known to Rick. In the distance, he could see the remains of a deer and the creature that had been eating it only yesterday. They approached the body, and Rick grabbed hold of the legs. "Help me drag it away from the tree," he said as he looked up at Glenn, who stood with a puzzled look on his face. What are we doing?" Glenn asked, not knowing what was going on. Rick stopped for a second, still looking at Glenn, and said, "Those things don't seem too smart. Yet I've never seen them mistake one of them for one of us. And I've seen a couple of those things that I think were alive from a distance. So I've been thinking what it could be that helps them tell us apart, and being close to this fella seals it. It's the smell." Glenn walked over and grabbed one of the legs from Rick to help him drag the body as he continued. "Now, I've seen some of them missing half a face. They're up and moving, but by all indications, they're not operating at peak performance. So I'm definitely not saying they're like bloodhounds that can tell us apart by smell. Maybe it's as simple as the fact that we don't stink like them, but I gotta think it has something to do with our smell. We've both got arms and legs. It should be easy for them to mix us up, but they never attack each other." When they got to a clearing not far from where the body originally was, both men dropped the legs of the creature, and Rick pulled the axe from his belt. As Glenn looked on a short distance away, Rick brought the axe down upon the wrist of the creature, severing its hand from its arm. Still holding the bloody axe in one hand, Rick reached down and picked up the hand and held it towards Glenn. "Here, rub this on your clothes and then stick it in your pocket. I think a few pieces for each of us ought to do it," he said as Glenn reached out to take the hand. As he did, a queasy feeling came over him. Glenn pulled himself together and wiped the puke from his mouth with the sleeve of his jacket. "Sorry, I just wasn't expecting this at all this morning. I'm used to the smell of the city, but getting it up close like this is a totally different story." As Glenn rubbed the hand across his legs, Rick, who was kneeling beside the body getting ready to hack another piece off, looked up at him. "Well, if I had known I'd be doing this today, I wouldn't have gotten out of bed," he said as he brought the axe down into the leg of the creature. "We've got to give this a shot, though." Rick dug into the leg of the creature, pulling out pieces of bloody, decomposing flesh, and started to rub it on the arm of his jacket, as Glenn continued rubbing the hand on his. As flies started to gather around the two, Glenn looked over at Rick and said, "Don't let anything get close to your face at all. These things are so nasty, I'd hate to think what would happen if you got something in your mouth. Their bites are fatal, and that's just them making contact with broken skin." A disgusted look came over Rick's face as he moved the chunk of flesh up towards his shoulder. He pulled his head away from the smell and replied, "Yeah, I don't think I'll be rubbing this shit on my face anytime soon." The two men, who were now completely covered in gore, sporting freshly cut hands in their pockets, stood looking at each other with disgusted looks from the stench. "I hope this works," Glenn said to Rick. "You and me both," Rick replied. "Yeah, I'm going to feel really stupid if we did this for nothing." Glenn pulled the map from his pocket and started to study it as the two men once again made their way towards the city. Suddenly, an explosion of vomit launched from Glenn's mouth as Rick turned away. Glenn turned to look at Rick, a trickle of vomit still in the corner of his mouth, and said, "Sorry about that. You know, if your smell theory is right, I'm going to be much safer than you." Glenn went back to scanning the map as Rick looked over at him as they continued on. As the city came into view over a forest of trees, the two stopped for a moment. "I need to scratch my nose," Rick said. Rick and Glenn reached the alley they had run down several days before, when Glenn rescued Rick from a horde. The creature that Rick hadn't noticed back then still sat up against the side of the building, apparently unable to go anywhere. They stopped just as they entered the alley and looked at each other. "Well," Rick said to Glenn, "let's see if this is going to work." The two approached the creature as it sat there, and it seemed as though Rick's plan was going to work. Nothing so far, Rick said as he waved his hand right in front of the creature's face. Suddenly, the creature raised its arm and smacked Rick's hand away. Both he and Glenn jumped back in shock and fear. The creature growled. Glenn fell back against the wall of the opposite building, grabbed on with both arms spread wide, turned his head, and closed his eyes. No way! This isn't going to work. It just isn't. Rick walked over to Glenn and pointed in the direction of the creature. Glenn, listen to me. Just slapped my hand away. It wanted me to leave it alone. This is going to work. Look at it, he said reassuringly. Glenn opened his eyes and looked over in the direction of the creature. It sat in the same position, a solemn look on its decomposed face. It's not coming after us, Rick said. The men continued on down the alley, looking around them cautiously. What a gloomy goddamn day, Rick said, looking up at the sky. Glenn turned his head to look back down the alley, making sure none of the creatures were sneaking up from behind, even though he knew they were safe. I don't know about you, but I was getting sick of all that sunshine contradicting what was going on down here. As they reached the end of the alley, they came to the fence with the loose board that led into another alley, which led towards the city. Rick pushed aside the loose board and started to climb through while Glenn waited. At least this is consistent, he said. Once through the fence and into the second alley, Glenn and Rick made their way quickly to the street where Rick and his horse were attacked. They stopped just shy of the street, careful to stay in the shadows. You ready for this? Rick asked Glenn as he looked at the street ahead. Not really, Glenn replied, concerned. Me neither, Rick assured him. They stepped out of the shadows and into the street, surrounded by litter and abandoned storefronts. Occasionally, a lone creature would shamble by, unaware of the two. God, you do this every day? Rick asked Glenn as he surveyed the surroundings. Glenn had the map out again and was studying it. Yep. According to the map, Pleasant Street is this way, he said, looking to his left. Side by side, Rick and Glenn made their way down the street, careful not to pass too close to any of the creatures, even with their camouflage. As they passed by a stringy-haired blonde creature carrying a teddy bear, Rick said, So far, so good. They don't seem to notice that we're talking, Glenn said as he looked over at Rick. Rick looked back at him and replied, They make sounds too. Maybe they can't tell the difference. As creatures shuffled by, the two men came to a stop a little ways from their original destination, a cross street just up ahead of them. Glenn took another look at the map and said to Rick as he glanced up at the next street, We need to go this way. We're almost there. I've never been this far into the city. They made their way to the next street and came to a dead stop. Christ, Rick said with a look of surprise on his face. Glenn lifted his head from the map and replied, It's worse than we thought. In front of them was an army tank and jeep. Surrounding both were bodies piled up on top of each other, some moving, others still. The ones that were up and walking about quickly surrounded the two, but didn't seem to notice them no matter how close they got. As the creatures clambered about, Glenn started to get concerned. Just stay calm. Don't freak out. We're going to be fine, Rick assured Glenn, even though he was a little concerned as one of the creatures brushed his arm. Look, there it is, Glenn said as he pointed down the street. From where they were standing, the gun store was only a couple 100 feet away. 1 second, Rick exclaimed as he grabbed a tipped-over shopping cart and righted it. He pushed it down the street towards the door of the gun store where Glenn was standing. What's that for? Glenn asked, looking at the shopping cart. We can carry more guns with it, Rick replied as Glenn looked around nervously. Oh, that makes sense, Glenn replied as he held out his hand at the door of the store. So, how are we going to get in? Rick pulled the axe once again from his belt and approached the door. This door is made of wood, he replied to Glenn as he swung the axe near the handle of the door. After a few good whacks, he kicked the door and it broke open. We need to hurry. Those things were looking at me while I hacked away at the door. I think they're noticing we're different, Rick said as he made his way inside. We're at a disadvantage not knowing how smart they are at all. Glenn followed Rick inside and made his way over to a wall that held several rifles and shotguns. On the shelf below, boxes of ammunition sat. What should we get? Glenn asked just as he was about to grab some ammo. Rick was walking towards him carrying as many handguns as he could muster. A little of everything, as much as we can fit in the cart. Make sure we get a lot of ammo. Glenn scooped up several boxes of ammo and turned his head back to look at Rick. We need to make sure we don't grab anything that won't work in the guns we get. Rick, who was several feet behind carrying ammo himself, acknowledged Glenn. Yeah, that's a good point. The two men tossed the box of ammo into the shopping cart that stood just outside the door of the shop. They had already loaded it almost full with weapons. You think we got enough? Glenn asked Rick as they walked just back inside. Rick was kneeling over his duffel bag, zipping it closed as he looked up at Glenn to respond. "For a while, at least. Let's go." As they walked outside, Rick led the way through the crowd of creatures as Glenn pushed the cart behind him. Suddenly, drops of water started to fall down upon them. Glenn looked up at the sky and exclaimed, "Shit, it's starting to rain." Rick had the axe out and swung it into the head of the creature closest to him. A terrified look came over Glenn's face. "What was that? You think they won't notice that?" he said as he started to push the cart faster. "Hurry," Rick replied as he secured the duffel bag over his shoulder and got ready to move quicker. "We're not going to last long in this rain." Overhead, a loud crack of thunder erupted through the sky, bringing both men to a halt as the rain started to pour down upon them. Rick immediately took off running as Glenn followed, pushing the shopping cart as fast as he could move it. "Shit!" Rick yelled out as the torrential rain came down all around them. What's wrong?" Glenn called out to Rick. Rick turned back to look at Glenn and said, "Look at them! The rain is washing the smell off!" The creatures that had not noticed the two men before were now fully aware that they were there and started to hone in on them en masse. "Shit! We're never going to make it!" Glenn screamed out in a panicked voice as he pushed the cart even faster. Rick grabbed hold of the front of the cart and pulled it as Glenn hung on. "Just run! Come on!" he yelled out through the rain. As the horde closed in, Rick yanked the cart faster as Glenn tried desperately to keep control. "Rick!" Glenn yelled as the cart tipped to one side, sending the two men, guns and ammo, spilling to the street. Rick grabbed one of the 9mm pistols from the pile, the axe in his other hand, and looked over at Glenn, who was lying on the ground trying to collect himself. "Get the cart up, Rat, and grab as many guns as you can. Hurry!" Rick yelled as he jumped into action. As Glenn turned the cart upright and started collecting what he could, Rick fired into the oncoming crowd of creatures, taking them down one by one. As Glenn collected the weapons, the bodies fell lifeless around him. "Oh God," Glenn murmured as he grabbed hold of a pistol from the ground. The horde of creatures seemed to multiply as Rick tried his best to keep them at bay, swinging the axe into the neck of one as another hit his hand with the gun, sending a shot wildly into the air. Behind him, one of the creatures closed in. It sank its teeth into his shoulder as Rick screamed out in terror. "Yeah!" The creature groaned as it pulled fabric clenched tightly in its jaw away from Rick's jacket as he raised the axe above his head. He swung himself around to face the creature and sank the axe deep into its skull, quickly pulled it out, and then fired one shot at point-blank range to make sure it was dead. Glenn was making his way with the cart and whatever he could collect through the horde when he turned back to Rick, who stood stunned, and said, "Come on, Rick! Hurry, or we won't make it!" Rick pulled himself from the shock and fired again into the crowd that surrounded them as Glenn rammed the cart into one of the creatures in his way, sending it flying to the ground. The two were now side by side, moving quickly away from the gathering masses. "We're almost home free!" Glenn yelled out as they kept up the pace. "Yeah!" Rick responded as he looked around himself in terror. He fired again, hitting one of the creatures that stood in their way, and then again clearing a path for them to get through. "I think we're going to make it," Glenn said, still pushing the cart with all his might. "Just keep running!" Rick yelled back. After several intense minutes of fending off creatures and running, Rick and Glenn made it back to the alley down the street. They kept running until they reached the wooden fence, and without a second thought, Rick kicked away the loose boards, and the two pulled the shopping cart through. They continued moving quickly until they reached a spot in the woods that seemed safe. "Okay," Rick said as he slowed down, breathing heavily. I think we've lost them. Let's take a breather." Suddenly, he grabbed his jacket and started to pull it off as fast as he could while a concerned Glenn looked on. "Rick?" he said, puzzled. Rick finally got his jacket off and turned to look at his shoulder, the one that the creature had bitten down on. "Oh, thank God! Oh, geez! Oh, man!" he exclaimed, the smile starting to cross his face. "I thought I'd been bitten." Glenn stared at Rick and with a slightly dry tone said, "No shit. Damn, I guess we really lucked out this time. Well, let's get these guns back to camp before it gets dark." Rick stood, staring off into the distance, and calmly replied, "Yeah, Glenn, please don't tell Lori how close we came." Back at the camp, Lori stood shivering in the pouring rain, staring at the woods, waiting for Rick to return safe, when Shane walked up behind her. "You got nothing to worry about, Lori. Rick can handle himself. You've seen what he's gotten through already. He and Glenn will be back before you know it." Lori continued to stare into the woods. I just wish he hadn't gone. Damn it! Why did he have to put me through this again?" "Come back to camp. It's too cold to be out in this rain," Shane said as he reached down to take Lori's hand and lean in closer to her. "Come on. Staying out here isn't going to make him come back any sooner. I'll keep you company." A look of disgust crossed Laurie's face as she quickly pulled her arm away from Shane's grasp. Shane, don't. You've got to stop. Rick is back now. He's alive, and he's my husband. You've got to stop this. As Laurie turned her attention back towards the woods, Shane watched her with a surprised look and pleaded, "But what about that night when we... on the road down here?" Laurie closed her eyes and lowered her head, her face filled with sadness and confusion. "That night," she said and paused for a moment. Slowly, she raised her head and opened her eyes. "That night was a mistake." This podcast is not endorsed by Skybound, Image Comics, or Robert Kirkman. It is intended for entertainment purposes only. The Walking Dead, all characters, names of characters, or other Walking Dead related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Skybound LLC and their respective trademark and copyright holders. The official Walking Dead site can be found at www.thewalkingdead.com. Songs: The Descent, Steel and Seething, and Undaunted by Kevin MacLeod. The main title theme by Gene Grasso. The Walking Dead audio comic is narrated and performed by Gene Grasso, and all original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Eugene Grasso unless otherwise indicated.